Hello, I'm Ted Gamble, Chair of the British Architectural Library Trust. The Trust is the nonprofit entity that supports the library and collections of the Royal Institute of British Architects in London. This is the fourth and final lecture in our 2023 series, presented in collaboration with the 20th Century Society, an organization that focuses on architectural education and the preservation of significant 20th century architecture. Today's lecture is entitled Modernism, Revolution or Reinvention. It will focus on some of the great British émigrés and émigré architects who created exceptional architecture in Britain in the 1920s and 30s. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to say a few words about Elaine Harwood, the renowned architectural historian and ardent preservationist of 20th century British architecture, who died suddenly on April 20th. Just a few weeks ago, on March 30th, Elaine presented the third lecture in our series, an outstanding discussion of the work of Charles Holden. Elaine was an extraordinary individual. She studied at the Architectural Association in London and received a PhD from the University of Bristol. She was a senior architectural historian and investigator with Historic England, and her work with the 20th Century Society saved multiple important buildings from demolition. Elaine was also an award-winning author and educator, and was an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. On a personal note, those of us who knew Elaine and had the pleasure of working her will always remember her as gracious and generous, with an infectious enthusiasm. Elaine had a true love of architecture and a passion for its care and preservation. Her unparalleled knowledge and commitment will continue to inspire. We will all miss her greatly. Today's lecture, Modernism, Revolution or Reinvention, will be presented by Alan Powers, the former chair of the 20th Century Society and a leading historian of 20th century design, art, and architecture in Britain. Alan studied at Cambridge, where he received both his undergraduate and PhD. He has written numerous reviews, articles, and books, and has curated multiple exhibitions on architecture and design. Alan currently teaches at the London School of Architecture and the London campus of New York University. He is an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. The interlocutor for today's lecture will be David Lewis, Professor of Architectural History at Oxford University. He is a noted architectural historian and the author of Modernizing Tradition, the Architectural Thought of Giles Gilbert Scott. David also presented the second lecture in this series on Giles Gilbert Scott and served as interlocutor for Elaine's presentation on Charles Holden. Following Alan's lecture, David will join Alan for further conversation. I'm now honored to present Alan Powers.
Well, thank you, Ted. And thank you for the words you said about Elaine. I had known her for nearly 40 years, I think, and we had worked together very productively and happily on many projects, shared a tremendous amount of fun, energetic expeditions, discoveries, meeting older architects, but she was always ahead of me. Her energy seemed to be unstoppable. I'd like to mention in particular an aspect of her work that actually wasn't mentioned by you, Ted, which was her work on publications by other authors in the context of the 20th Century Society. She joined me in producing our journal, which comes out about every 2 years, called 20th Century Architecture, and made an enormous contribution to that. And we were in together at the beginning of the series 20th Century Architects, a series of monographs on individual architects and practices, which aimed to fill gaps in the literature. And with the emergence in the past 7 days of the volume on Patrick Gwynne by Neil Bingham, it has reached 20 titles in the course of 14 years. Her work on that was indefatigable and incredibly meticulous, and very concerned that the presentation of the book should be as good as the quality of the text. So we are already thinking, how on earth do we keep going without her? But we shall try, because that's almost certainly what she, I'll take away that almost, it is absolutely what she would have wished. I have a privilege that I've arranged to write an obituary of Elaine for the Guardian newspaper, which I shall start work on as soon as this lecture is finished. And it will appear online probably before it appears in print. The Guardian has no paywall, so you may wish to have a look and find out more about her life. But now on to the lecture. There are different ways of looking at modern architecture. And modern architecture in England has its own story. I might say Britain. I'm keeping to England for a reason I'll explain shortly. And just need to find the button. I had it there just now. There we are. England was the term chosen for this exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1937. And I think this provides a very useful hook, perhaps particularly for an audience that may be predominantly American, to see what was going on at the time. I've written an academic article on this, for which the reference will appear at the end of the talk. So you can look up there for more detail. It was fascinating to research. After 1930, the scattered seeds of an alternative architectural culture began to sprout in Britain. And only 7 years later, Henry Russell Hitchcock could claim that England leads the world in modern architectural activity. This has been viewed merely as a prelude to the more universal elimination of historically based design and construction practices after 1945 in Britain, but deserves attention in its own right. So in this lecture, I will present a range of work by some British-born and trained architects and engineers, but also the important contribution of émigrés designers who not only planted ideas, but took cues also from what already existed in England. Spanning from commitment to social change to a dandyish perfection of form, the decade of the 1930s is, I think, more contradictory and mysterious than is sometimes assumed. The claim made by Hitchcock, that I quoted already in the catalogue to the exhibition, which you see here, is a bold one, given that it ranks England so high, and indeed most people in England couldn't take it seriously, and some of them still can't. This suggests problems of historiography, which I will look at shortly. But in the meantime, just a couple of images of the exhibition installation. It's not terribly well documented. And here is one of the rooms. It followed the style of the earlier International Style exhibition in having black and white photographs very austerely stuck to the white walls, but quite elegant in their way. This is a whole room of the work of the practice tecton, which we shall be looking at. This is actually of particular interest, I think. These were pre-existing panels on the history and current state of housing that were shipped over from London and subsequently disappeared in the tour of the exhibition, which extended into the period of the Second World War. Although Catherine Bauer wrote a commentary in the book on housing in England, these are perhaps more radical and represent an aspect of what the English, at any rate, wanted to represent. more radical than the other architectural commissions that appeared, which don't in fact include very much housing. So this, if you like, is the baseline, as it was, I think, for many people at the time. A widely circulated popular book. This exhibition also toured extensively. It wasn't just shown in New York. And here we have my rendering of the three principles that define the international style, as compiled by Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson. An architecture of volume rather than mass, regularity rather than axial symmetry, and no arbitrary applied decoration. Well, I think we have all internalized those as being what modern architecture is. However, I don't think they're quite as unproblematic, perhaps, as they look. And Hitchcock himself began to question them in later times. England was not particularly well represented in the selection of photographs. These are the two buildings that appeared, and of these only the right-hand one was illustrated in the book. There could have been more, I think, even at this date, which in terms of architectural development in England could be considered quite early. I've picked this as an example, which Hitchcock himself seems to have had doubts about this because Owen Williams was an engineer, but I would claim that it qualifies as a fairly outstanding, fully realized modern structure with a definite utilitarian purpose and an application of structural ends to means that fully qualifies in his three criteria. However, I think it's also worth noting that while England only had one example, the same applied to Austria, Belgium, Finland, and Italy, all of which had perhaps rather more developed modern architecture than England did at the time. The International Style book tried to clarify its subject for a broad general public through what might be seen as over-restrictive and primarily visual definitions. The author stated that the contemporary style is unified and inclusive, not fragmentary and contradictory, and went on to specify its characteristics in the terms that I've set out. So it looked perhaps as if the long anxiety about a style for the age, for either the 19th or 20th century, had finally been resolved. Even if not everybody agreed about this new style, Hitchcock and Johnson claimed that it was real, not just an idea, and we can agree. But such moments of clarity can be deceptive because life and its circumstances are complex. For example, derivation from structure that was stated as one of the general principles is often neglected in reality. Buildings have to compromise, and while the famous Villa Savoye by Le Corbusier presents a pure white surface, that is, if it's been repainted recently, you can see from the construction photograph that, in fact, it was a bit more empirical than that, not a pure concrete building, but a frame with a brickwork infill, then plastered over. And it wasn't unique from that point of view. This raises a bigger question of whether we demand a literal image from a building, or whether we accept something that is, in fact, to some degree, a fiction. And that, in turn, could undermine the definitions of modern architecture in terms of what it looks like. The question of function is equally questionable. Buildings dripping with ornament could be highly functional for their users, and the reverse can also be true. So the so-called functional buildings often failed in all sorts of ways, thermally, structurally, and not least in establishing an emotional relationship for the people in them. So omitted from the Hitchcock and Johnson criteria were anything to do with the improvement of society. which for many modern architects was the third pillar on which the movement stood. They've been routinely criticized for that ever since, and rightly so, I think. The Modern Architecture in England exhibition, while having its section on housing, equally took an essentially aesthetic view. So much for the revolution in my title. What about the reinvention? And why is that significant in assessing modern architecture in England? Here are my historiographical problems. England comes late, and therefore whatever it does can't be right. It can't be original. It's always lagging behind. If it does depart from the norm, it can't be right either, because the norm is defined by what has gone before. This, I think, is what's called double bind, or catch-22. And many commentators have fallen for that. We have to think more broadly, I think. I've put in at number 3, assessing the emigre quotient. Many people have claimed, without really looking into it, that modern architecture in England couldn't have happened without emigres, from Germany chiefly, about whom I shall talk. My view is that it was a moving train onto which the emigres were able to climb, and they then contributed a lot, but they didn't start up the engine. Impurity is English modernism not quite pure enough, could also be claimed, that it shades off into various kinds of romanticism. Now, you will see things that could qualify into this title, and I will talk about them further. For English people, there is, I think, a strong element of what Australians refer to as cultural cringe, that we just can't believe that we can do this properly. And it would upset us to think that we could. This perhaps changes in the post-war period, but it has become a fixed belief in relation to the 1930s. A sixth one, I think, is the fact that we still don't know everything. I'm going to show you examples of buildings that are relatively well known, but were not at the time and subsequently. So the work of historians in redressing some of these imbalances, buildings that weren't photographed, that weren't published, etc., I think is important and overcomes some of the possible myth-making. But I wanted to look first in terms of reinvention. Nicholas Pevsner, in his well-known book, Pioneers of Modern Design, from William Morris to Walter Gropius, 1936, tried to trace a historiography, and he wasn't the first, that originates with William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, and then after a fallow period in which, as it were, the inspiration crosses the channel and is replanted, it then comes back again. Well, it's not entirely wrong, but it's always worth remembering that those who were among the ones he was praising for being pioneers, when they saw what came back, they didn't necessarily like it. CFA Voisey, for example, wrote a letter to an Australian architect in England, Raymond McGrath, who'd asked Voisey to write a foreword for his book 20th Century Houses, published in 1934. Voisey responded, "Going a whoring with foreign styles has poisoned our architecture," and more in the same nationalistic and individualistic vein. William Richard Letherby, you can see here, he wished for structural perfection without ornamentation, which sounds very like modernism, but once he'd seen the photographs that were being circulated, he wrote in this letter that you can see here. This requires rather more explanation than I have time to give you, but I will read out his coda here, written to his friend Stanley Peach. "And the jazzery jump that EIA are taking to illustrate the thing, my double eye, only another kind of design humbug to pass for the shrug, ye old modernist style. We must have style to copy. What funny stuff this art is. So he saw that in getting rid of the historic styles, the modernists had, in a way, jumped into a similar problem of conformity rather than inventing more directly from the circumstances in which they found themselves. And I think he was right. Another of the relatively unusual commentators who could see that aspect was this man, Harry Stewart Goodhart Rendell. Here's a building of his about as modern as he got. He believed that any style was admissible provided it suited the occasion of the work, the context, the purpose, the materials. He referred to modernists as inconscient slaves of their own styleless stylism. That is to say, they were just as much trapped in a style as anybody else. They just didn't recognize it. And again, I think he was right. So we have, I think, issues of placing a building such as this, extremely well known from the moment of its inception as a sort of national monument, but still strangely lacking from historical overviews. To me, this is part of what I'm only now realizing is a kind of lost English expressionism. And expressionism in Germany, particularly, or in other countries, is likewise almost a lost movement, I think, in its everyday applications. This could be extended perhaps to Charles Gilbert Scott just as much, about whom David Fraser Lewis was talking in this series. Elizabeth Scott was a rather distant relation of his, also prominent, of course, as a woman architect winning a major competition. And in a sense, that aspect of the project has been given more attention than what the building actually looks like. There's also a question of influence. It seems obvious to couple Charles Holden's Arnos Grove station here with the public library by Asplund, which we know he'd visited not very long before. But is it a copy? I don't think so. My reasoning for the choice at Arnos Grove of a cylinder is that people entering the station have to take a right-angled turn, and the curved form makes that much easier to do. Holden is also worth mentioning in that he is perhaps the most authentic carryover from the arts and crafts movement, in which he began his career, to his form of modernism, which was certainly recognized and praised by Hitchcock, by Hefner, and by many others. And of course, the subject of Elaine's previous talk in the series. But what about this? This could have been in the MoMA 1932 exhibition, I think. But I doubt if Hitchcock knew about it. It was published in a slightly obscure place in a magazine. And it's also the work of a partnership of two women architects. So this is to make my point that we don't know everything. And while this has been now recirculated somewhat, I would suggest it's still not really in the canon. This is a very different matter. The Penguin Pool at London Zoo, being in London as it was, being a place of popular resort for people of all kinds, won what Hitchcock, in an article in the Architect and Building News, called a wide and unself-conscious acceptance of the fullest technical and aesthetic possibilities of modern architecture, both by semi-public authorities, I think by which he meant the zoo, but other similar things, and by the great public itself. Such an acceptance is as yet unknown in America and certainly rather rare elsewhere in the world. Well, this is a wonderful building. I show you a picture from the last days of the Penguins, actually. They have now departed because it was finally decided that it was unsuitable for them. which is rather a shame. I've also popped in a penguin in motion from Harwood film that he made for the 1937 exhibition, which I think, if anybody can challenge me on this, I'd be glad to know, I think was the first film specially made for an architectural exhibition anywhere, and has its own interesting story. Lubetkin was clearly Hitchcock's favorite among the architects that he knew, and he did travel frequently to England and got to know most of them. And it's very easy to understand why. Lubetkin was a star of European quality. He'd come to England not as a political refugee, but in search of work, having previously been in Paris. There is much literature on him, but especially the monograph by John Allen, which is a wonderful piece of work. John is also an architect who has worked on the conservation of Lubetkin's buildings. I'm not dwelling on the second High Point building, which you can see in the right-hand part of this image, but that is significant because it does change from the purism of the first white monolithic concrete structure to a different structural form, which Lubetkin felt needed a different form of architectural expression, and the purist critics didn't like that. They had a very rigid idea of what counted and what didn't. Certainly there is no apartment house in America, and hardly more than 2 or 3 in the world, that reach anywhere near this level of excellence in middle-class housing, wrote Hitchcock. But now to a genuine political emigre, Erich Mendelsohn, who, as his name suggests, was Jewish, realized that he couldn't stay in Germany, came to England late in 1933, where he was already well known, and in fact was probably the best known German architect of that time, although Gropius soon overtook him. He went into partnership with Serge Chimaev, and they won their competition entry for this pleasure pavilion at a seaside resort, which thankfully has survived very unaltered and very well used all through its history. There's much to be said about this, but I will quote what Hitchcock wrote, which I think is interesting, because for Hitchcock it was the English Mendelssohn, as it were, that he much preferred to the German Mendelssohn of the earlier buildings, which were more overtly expressionist. He said, "A certain understatement, a determined restraint, was a desirable corrective of the earlier tendencies of his personal style." You can decode that language rather easily. I think personal is bad, restraint is good, and at any rate, this is what has been achieved. The staircase, perhaps, is still a totally recognizable Mendelssohn signature, but a wonderful one. As Hitchcock went on, whether the change in manner is represented by this English work, the change in manner represented by this English work is due to a new environment or to the influence of his partner, is not clear. Well, I'm sure the partner, Chimaev, would have claimed that it was. Mendelssohn, I suspect, would have denied it, but we'll never really know the answer. So one of the rather delightful things that happened was that Gropius, the founder of the Bauhaus School in Germany, and becoming a world-famous figure, although strangely, his name and his achievement were not very well understood in England, almost before the point where he arrived in 1934. Suddenly he burst on the scene and was hailed as a kind of messiah who would lead England to modernism. Gropius, with his partner Maxwell Fry, built a house adjoining this one by Mendelssohn and Chimaev in Chelsea. They were actually built for 2 clients who were cousins, and they'd acquired the building site together. there is much to learn from this, I think, that Gropius chose a rather picturesque approach, and Mendelssohn a rather more austere, serene, you could almost say classical one. It partly depends on where these buildings are on the site, I think, as much as anything, but it shows a range of possibilities, explored both structures of brick with white surfaces. The Gropius and Frey house, perhaps rather sadly, has been overclad and altered quite considerably in comparison to the Mendelssohn and Chimaev one, although the glass extension that you can see on the right-hand side is in fact an addition by Norman Foster in the early 2000s. I can't forbear telling you a story. I went to visit Chimaev in Cape Cod. He was 94 years old. I did subsequently write a book about him. And he had helped me in a campaign to try and modify this edition by saying that he didn't agree with it. And that was because Norman Foster had been claiming that he was absolutely in the right to do it because Chimaev had taught him at Yale. Anyway, I thanked Chimaev, and he said to me, I will try and imitate his voice, "Beware of Norman. He's an operator." Rather memorable moment. Marcel Breuer also came to England, invited by Gropius, and both of them, of course, went on to the US, and Gropius taught at Harvard, Breuer more briefly there. And this, I think, is an exceptional building, and it's one that Breuer himself recognized. He said it was one of the two most important buildings he'd ever done, the other one being the UNESCO building in Paris, a huge discrepancy of scale. This is tiny and only lasted for a month or so because it was an exhibition building. UNESCO, quite another matter. I suspect it was, in part anyway, the exploration of materials that made him cherish this as a memory. His partner, York, I was told by York's partner that Breuer couldn't have handled this stonework without York's advice. So in a sense, this partnership was very productive on this occasion. But also interesting, I think, is this much lesser well-known work by Breuer, a pair of houses for Eton College, no less, built of brick. Brick is one of the themes that Hitchcock explored in the catalogue to modern architecture in England, because he thought it was a natural local material and therefore appropriate to use in England, particularly in urban areas where there was very heavy air pollution from burning coal. But I'm going to quote another writer, the Italian writer, Giulio Argan, who wrote very interestingly, I think, both on Breuer and on Gropius. And of Breuer, he wrote, "The combination of different materials and of differently treated surfaces, often considered as the fruit of American experience, is instead of English origin. This is further confirmed by the school buildings constructed by Gropius in conjunction with Max Frey at Impington, which I will now move on to." This is a very well-known building. It was the largest one that Gropius achieved while he was in England, although ironically, perhaps, the actual building on site didn't start until he'd left, and he never actually saw it until many years later. But his assistant, Jack Howe, in the Maxwell Frey office, faithfully carried out his intentions while at the same time having to do a lot of what we now call value engineering, of cutting the cost without losing the quality of the building. But what I think is striking about this, people I suspect go there expecting to see something like the Bauhaus building, and it just isn't. It's modest in scale. It has none of that sort of rush and speed of machine aesthetic. It is, of course, over 10 years later than the Bauhaus building, and a great deal has changed, not only with Gropius moving to a different country, but in the world of architecture generally and in the modern movement. The move towards biomorphic form, a greater sense of regionalism and locality have become major themes which are really universal among the architects. You might say perhaps that Mies van der Rohe is relatively unaffected by these, but they are very widespread. And we are in a different era, and it just happened that it was in England that both Breyer and Gropius encountered this and carried it with them to the USA, where, of course, it joins hands, if you like, metaphorically anyway, with what Frank Lloyd Wright had been doing there for years. But I think of interest here particularly is the choice of a local brick, the situation of the building amidst the existing trees, the curve of the wing that's coming towards us in this photograph, which housed the village college element, which is to say that it's a school combined with a sort of evening facility for local adults, are all contributions to that, and the bay windows, the rather domestic bay windows. Gropius also built a wooden house. He built one of these for Sommerfeld in Berlin early in his career, but this was a trend that was growing in England. This house is routinely omitted from Gropius survey volumes, I think because people feel it doesn't have the right image, but it's definitely by him, and I think very successful. There's something about that porch, which is just a little bit bigger than you might have expected, that distinguishes it. But there were other wooden houses, and wooden houses had been a German phenomenon, which is perhaps less recognized than it should be. And for various reasons, this became a popular form. Justin Blanco White, as she preferred to be named, didn't build very much. She knew Gropius, however, and we can perhaps see a connection with this house here. Most famous of these is Chemaev's house, Bentley Wood in Sussex, seen here in some original pre-war color photographs. And here is a comment from a different writer, Christopher Hussey of Country Life, often seen as rather a conservative, although he'd been enthusiast for modernism early on. And he's looking back from 1 year into the Second World War, writing about it, and seeing that seeing it as symptomatic of a bigger change from reinforced concrete as being the norm for modernism to a greater choice of traditional materials, in this case timber frame and siding. You could class this as American perhaps equally well. Anyway, Hussey felt re-inspired by modernism, having seen this. So this counts for me as, in many ways, a form of reinvention. And Chemaev's friend, contemporary, in many ways a similar figure, was Erno Goldfinger. I'm sorry, I haven't captioned this one. This house has become well known because it's possible to visit the center part of it that was Goldfinger's own house, completed in 1939, almost contemporary with the Chemaev house we were just looking at. Built of brick in an urban setting in this occasion, and justified by its architect as local, appropriate, London in style. It didn't prevent there being opposition to this scheme, which I think was rather ridiculous. Here I'm showing you a letter from Julian Huxley, director of the zoo, brother of Aldous Huxley, later head of UNESCO, arguing that the houses are a logical development of the formal domestic style of the 18th and early 19th centuries. Well, maybe this is special pleading, but it's certainly what the architect himself said, and this page was compiled in the Architect's Journal to support the case that houses in the vicinity displayed the same characteristics. You couldn't see the roof. It might just as well have been flat. The windows were regular rectangles, and so on. And it was the Victorian houses with their bay windows and prominent roofs that were the discordant element. And the English townhouse is an element of reinvention that I haven't mentioned, but was one that it almost required overseas architects to tell the English what a great asset they had here. One of the first was the Danish architect Sten Eiler Rasmussen in his book London, the Unique City. But here is Bruno Taut, a well-known German architect whose book Modern Architecture was published in England very early on in the development of the movement, with a special final chapter to talk about England itself. He came for a summer holiday to look at it, and he upheld these Georgian terraces as being ideal models to follow. So I hope I've been able to show you that there is a strong element of reinvention involved, which doesn't, in my view, make any of the architecture less modern in ways that matter in other fields. And Hitchcock, I think, was right to recognize that this was, in its way, a major achievement. One final building here, notable, I think, because the team who worked on it were English, if that matters. It absorbed the study of German department stores, mostly ones by Mendelssohn, but then anglicized them, changing the emphasis from horizontal to vertical, and becoming, for whatever reason, a modern building that nobody ever has objected to, as far as I'm aware, and perhaps a sign that a form of modernism could be perfectly well acclimatized. And here, finally, the reference to the article I mentioned at the beginning. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alan. That was incredibly erudite as usual, and certainly gave us a great sense of the subtlety and range of modern architecture in Britain in the 1930s, and to some extent in the 1920s. And it's very interesting what you say about the emigres getting onto a moving train, as it were. There's already a sort of modern movement in Britain, and it's not fair at all to attribute the emergence of international modernism in the UK to the arrival of emigres, and that the emigres themselves are learning on some level from what's already happening in Britain. And that's something I think we can return to in a moment. But for my first question for you, I wanted to ask, you talked about a sort of catch-22, that sort of any English ideas about what modern architecture could be were never going to be accepted by some people because they were late on the scene and there were already ideas coming from elsewhere about what modern architecture should look like. And therefore, if they didn't follow those ideas, they were accused of not understanding. And if they imitated those ideas, they were accused of being imitators of what was going on the continent. How did British architects working with various alternative ideas about what modernity could be, how did they react to the arrival of continental modernist emigres? What was the range of reactions, and how did they respond to the modern movement?
Well, as far as we can tell, the reactions were very largely positive. There was some initial pushback at the idea of immigrants taking our jobs. But most architects or many architects, certainly the ones in the modernist camp, were liberal-minded and sympathetic to these victims of persecution. And they did also value the skills that they brought, which were not necessarily in the kind of broad concept, although that would apply to some of the big names we've looked at. They were very diligent workers. They had practices of drawing that were of a higher technical standard than English offices were used to. So I think they fed in, as it were, from the bottom as well as from the top. And that's something that is much less well documented. So the other factor, I think, is this catching up, we could call it, because if you like, when it begins in the early 1930s, we are lagging 5 or more years behind. But it always seems to me that architects who wanted to be modern, and it was a case of kind of almost undergoing a conversion, they had to do their one concrete building at least. And once you'd done that, you didn't have to do it again. And often the experience of doing it was enough to show you that it wasn't necessarily a good idea.
Right, right. Yes, it's interesting that there was that moment of conversion for a number of English architects. It's interesting to look at Elizabeth Scott's work, for instance. She has the Shakespeare Theatre, which, as you say, is a sort of lost English expressionism. But then very soon afterwards, she's doing an international modernist sort of factory building, which is quite a...
Hang on a moment, David. That's a different Scott.
Oh, is it? Oh,
it's confusing.
Yes, okay. Betty Scott and Elizabeth Scott, not the same person.
No.
No, I should know better than that. Okay, well, some of these architects who did have conversions, then it certainly is a significant change for people like C.H. Riley. Then he's a conversion, surely, if there is one. In the early 30s, he's saying that modernism is interesting leaven in the dough of British architecture, but it's not appropriate for urban locations. And by the middle of the 30s, he's working on Peter Jones. What do you think it is that pushed these architects to make that kind of a change?
Yes, I think Riley is exceptional, and he's a fascinating character. Somebody wrote at the time that I have to paraphrase this from memory. Says the difference between tradition and modernism is for some of us an unbridgeable gulf. But Professor Riley, with a noble gesture, waves the gulf away, and behold, it is no longer there.
Right.
So it was something that happened in his head, and I think I've always read his character as somebody who didn't like getting old. He wanted to be with the young and to keep up. So he's a bit like the the guy who's on the dance floor when really he perhaps shouldn't be. But I think it was a generous gesture. Crabtree was his student. He'd pushed him forward for this job, and I think tracking Crabtree's progress, acting as liaison with the client, particularly, who was his friend, would have brought him further into the fold, as it were. But what is interesting is that, unlike the modernists who belonged to the Mars group, Riley maintained an understanding and sympathy for the people he left behind, as it were, and would write an annual feature in the Architect's Journal reviewing the architecture of the previous year and being quite even-handed about it.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Riley is, as you say, is a curious and somewhat unusual case. There were certainly architects in Britain who were not sympathetic to international modernism as well, and felt that it was a wrong turn and was not the only answer for what modernity could look like. Giles Gilbert Scott was somewhere in the middle, trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, but there were certainly critics in English cultural life who were strongly opposed to it. I mean, Evelyn Waugh and Max Beerbohm jumped to mind. Max Beerbohm calling modern architecture monstrous robot warrens. Do you feel that how, this is a big question. It's not one I think I should probably throw in, but I'm going to. How did those architects end up losing that debate? Why was it that this particular notion about what modernity can look like became dominant after the Second World War?
Yes, it's a good question. And the people you mentioned were not architects.
No, I know, but there were architects who felt that way.
For example, there were. It became partly a question of your age, and Scott, his contemporaries, Vincent Harris, Albert Richardson, carried on with their convictions. They got plenty of work until they were off the scene by about 1960. Harris even went on longer. Then it was the question of the younger generation, in whom I am particularly interested: Raymond Erith, Donald McMorran, Stephen Dykes-Bauer. There were not very many of them. It was a hard life for them. It was partly, I think, that the modernists were a bit like kind of communist entryists. They took over the institutions in a very organized way and kept nominating their own people into positions of influence. And that's a story that hasn't been told. It was not really the result of popular acclaim, I would say. It was more a manipulation at the professional level, which in the course of time produced negative effects, in the sense that people were encouraged to question much of what had been given to them. And we are still, I think, coping with the divisions that have resulted.
Yes, I think that's certainly a fair statement. Giles Gilbert Scott called it a propaganda war. And Lutyens certainly expressed a wish that he had been better trained in the art of speaking and writing, because he felt that was increasingly necessary to defend what it was that he was doing with architecture. One, I think, probably final question for you, which is what you talked about the role of the for instance, Breuer's English partner, F.R. York, in helping him learn to work with stonework, sort of adjust to English materials such as brick, and temper his approach in certain ways. What was England's contribution to early international modernism? What was it that these émigrés architects took away with them as they moved on, for the ones who ended up in the United States and in other places?
I think, well, there are different ways of describing it. It could be pragmatism, it could be romanticism, which I think is always inherent in modernism anyway, but it just takes different forms. And a greater informality of plan form, a relaxation. It's something for which I've adopted the phrase nice modern, which I think in fact was an international trend of the middle century decades. It's more decorative, it's more relaxed, and it gets pushed aside by a new generation who want to, as much as going forwards, they want to go backwards. And I've heard this, directly from people of that period, that, the people they had once admired had gone soft, and it was necessary to go back to the 1920s and start again from the heroic period, as Alison and Peter Smithson called it.
Right, backwards to the more sort of purist and puritanical iterations of international modernism. Yes. But again, that's a place where some architects are going down that path, but then there's a very clear stream that continues towards softening modernism. Surely it's a sort of two-pronged.
Well, we're getting into deep waters here.
Okay.
What is described as brutalism is one manifestation of that sort of harder approach, which in England certainly had considerable traction for at least 10 years. Before then, there was another phase of softening. Some people, of course, don't change with the wind, but we tend to look at the ones who do.
Yes, I suppose that's true. Do you have any closing thoughts about the nature of architectural discourse? Because it seems to be that it's been a major theme today. The flow of influence and the way architects' ideas change with fashion and with new ideas, or don't change with fashion and new ideas.
Well, I would say my final thoughts are, we've always got to look, and if possible, look at the actual building, not just at the photograph, and find criteria for assessing it and understanding it, and not believe what we read in books. In fact, very often what gets said and written is the opposite of what's really the case. So there is a lot of, I think, quite entertaining unscrambling still to be done.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And your own career has been a great work of unscrambling, and you've contributed to that, I think, as much as anyone else. Thank you so much, Alan. This was really a fantastic talk. And we will now hand things back over to Ted for a concluding statement.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank both Alan and David for their participation in what has been a wonderful program. Thank you again. Information on the British Architectural Library Trust, as well as links to other lectures in this series, as well as additional programming, can be found at thebaltrust.org. Information on the 20th Century Society can be found on its website, C20 Society.org.uk. And thank you again for joining us. Good evening.